Hazelton is one of the oldest settlements in northern British Columbia. Its European settlement goes back to 1866, when the Collins Overland telegraph went through. At the junction of the Bulkley and Skeena Rivers, Hazelton was the original gateway and staging area for the Omineca Gold Rush of 1869 to 73. It also had the only proper hospital for hundreds of miles. In 2016, its population was 313. In 2021, its population was 257. After the First World War, a new mode of transportation made a grand entrance. In 1920, the first airplanes arrived. Hazelton was foreseen as the hub of air traffic to Alaska. 20 years later, aircraft no longer needed to stop every few miles and instead flew non-stop to their destinations. Preparations for the landing of the first aircraft began in spring 1920 with the arrival of two captains, one from the United States Army Air Service and one from the Canadian Air Force, who also represented the Canadian Air Board. Arriving on the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, they were selecting sites for the Alaska Air Expedition from New York to Nome. It would depart New York in mid-July 1920. The two captains initially selected a landing site close to the hospital, but the advance party had underestimated the takeoff length required by the expedition's 4 de Havilland DH-4Bs. The site selected was across the Bulkley River at its junction with the Skeena. Now called Anderson Flats, at the time it was known as Mission Point and was an oat field. A section had to be cut to allow landing of the 4 aircraft. On August 13th, the 4 aircraft took off from Prince George and 3 hours later landed at the Mission Point Aviation Park. The field worked out well for landing, but before takeoff, the field had to be compacted. Townspeople who had come out to witness the event were pressed into service, tramping up and down the fields to pack it into a usable runway. The crews stayed overnight at Hazelton and were hosted to a dinner and dance by the local First World War veterans. On Saturday, August 14th, the weather was reported good at their next destination. All 4 aircraft took off that afternoon. The flight continued successfully, landing at Wrangell, Alaska, Whitehorse and Dawson City, Yukon, and at Fairbanks, Ruby, and Nome, Alaska. They arrived in Nome on August 23, 1920. On September 29th, 3 of the 4 again landed at the Mission Point Airfield. 3 remained at Hazelton until October 4th, waiting for one captain. He had returned from Alaska on the Canadian Pacific steamship Princess Alice to Prince Rupert. He then took the train to Hazelton and flew back to New York, replacing another crewman who took the train. The following year, at the end of August 1921, another American aviator landed at the Mission Point field. Clarence Prest, known as Ollie, was a First World War aviator with the United States Air Service. He had left Las Vegas in late July and crossed into Canada at Lethbridge on August 8th. Prest had worked his way to Edmonton, barnstorming, giving rides, and doing aerobatics at small towns to earn his expenses. Prest, accompanied by an air mechanic, was flying a Curtiss JN-4D Jenny named the Polar Bear. He had stated his intent of flying from Mexico to Siberia. Leaving Edmonton August 18th or 19th, he flew via Jasper and Prince George to Hazelton. Prest entertained the townspeople with stunts and offered rides for cash. However, his engine quit on a takeoff, leaving him to land in a small field down the Skeena River. The aircraft was not badly damaged and no one was hurt. With the help of willing locals, he brought his Polar Bear to town in a canoe. It was transported to a workshop next to the Hudson Bay Company store and repaired. Prest had originally intended to fly along the Yukon Telegraph route to Telegraph Creek on the route of the 1920 return flight of the Alaska Flying Expedition. But he was suspicious of the quality of fuel obtained locally and decided to ship the aircraft to Prince Rupert on the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway, departing Hazelton on September 1st, 1921. The Air Board had come into existence after the First World War. One of its mandates was to regulate aviation in Canada by licensing pilots, aircraft, landing grounds, and seaplane landing areas, which it categorized as air harbors. In February 1922, Hazelton was visited by a Canadian Air Board inspector, inspecting the Mission Point Airfield as an approved air harbor for land and sea aircraft. Sea aircraft were to use the adjoining waters of either the Skeena or Bulkley Rivers. The Air Board's report of 1922 gives its first published list of approved air harbors. In British Columbia, only one approved landing field is named: Hazelton. The report states that alighting areas are available for land and seaplanes, and the field available is 600 by 1,800 feet. It also states that customs are available. Until then, all aircraft using the Mission Point Airfield had been passing through to other destinations. But the airfield had a profound effect, as many started to see the benefits and possibilities of air travel. One such group was the Railway Employees Investment and Industrial Association of Hazelton. It purchased a Junkers JL-6 from Imperial Oil in Edmonton. In mid-July 1922, the wheel-equipped Junkers was flown westward by Major George A. Thompson, with stops at Jasper and Prince George. On its arrival in Hazelton, the Junkers was mounted on floats. It was flown by Thompson on prospecting and hunting expeditions. In summer 1922, it became the first aircraft flown to the Queen Charlotte Islands, now known as Haida Gwaii. In the year of its operation at Hazelton, the Junkers covered a considerable amount of British Columbia's Northland, and in 1922, flying into this unmapped territory was risky. For aircraft en route to the Yukon and Alaska, Mission Point Airfield continued to be an important stop for fuel, weather, and accommodation. At that time, there was no airfield at Terrace or Prince Rupert. The accepted route was to fly west from Prince George to Hazelton, refuel, then follow the Yukon Telegraph line north to Telegraph Creek, then Atlin, and into the Yukon. Pilots often sent a request to the telegraph lineman to light fires to indicate the way. In early November 1928, an Alexander Eagle Rock was being flown from the factory in Colorado Springs. It had barnstormed its way to Hazelton with stops in Williams Lake, Quesnel, Vanderhoof, Smithers, and others. Headed for Whitehorse, it was flown by John M. Patterson and aircraft owner Clyde Wann of the Yukon Airways and Exploration Company. A new Cessna AW landed at Mission Flats on April 20, 1929, with Parker D. Kramer and Willard Gamble. They had left Chicago in early April, intending to fly to Siberia and return. The next day, they took off for Whitehorse. They landed at Nome, and on April 26th, overflew an island in Siberia. The next day, they started their return flight via Fairbanks, Whitehorse, and Atlin. They followed the Yukon Telegraph line to Hazelton, where they landed on the 30th. After refueling, they departed for Prince George and Edmonton. About a year later, an American Travel Air from San Francisco landed at Hazelton on its way to Whitehorse. The 8-seat, bright scarlet monoplane was flown by J.C. McFadden of Lakeport, California, with 2 passengers. No fuel was available at Hazelton, so McFadden took off for the new Smithers Aviation Park. Because McFadden had failed to clear Canadian customs, the aircraft was impounded in Whitehorse. It remained there until early August. An American pilot ferried it via Atlin and Telegraph Creek to Hazelton. The pilot and his girlfriend, teacher Myrtle Smith, picnicked at Mission Flats, departing the next day for Prince George on their way to Vancouver and Seattle. In late October, American pilot Frank Dorbent of Pacific International Airways landed his Balanca CH-300 pacemaker at Hazelton for refuel. He was en route to Telegraph Creek to join the search for Patty Burke. Burke was missing in the Liard River. In June 1933, an around-the-world record attempt by Jimmy Mattern ended in a crash in Siberia. His supporters in New York organized a relief expedition, and on the morning of the 5th, a Balanca CH-300 took off from Prince George, and after landing at Hazelton for fuel, turned northwest. Hazelton pioneer Eric Jantz recalls 5 flying boats landing on the river. One clipped a cottonwood tree on landing. These were likely the 5 Eastman E-2C rovers, all built in 1930 in Detroit and powered by Curtiss R600 Challenger engines. The 5 Sea Rovers were being flown across Canada along the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway line. They had departed Walkerville, Ontario in late May 1932 as part of a mining expedition known as the Mitchell Exploration Company of Canada. The group arrived in Hazelton in early June, heading for Juneau, Alaska. Jantz reported a Ford tri-motor at Hazelton in the 1930s. White Pass Airways of Whitehorse had purchased a Ford tri-motor in Seattle in the fall of 1934 and hired an experienced pilot to fly it. Vern Bookwalter landed at Hazelton en route to Whitehorse, where the Ford went to work on scheduled flights from Skagway to Whitehorse, Mayo, and Dawson City. In late July 1935, a Canadian Airways Fairchild 71C seaplane arrived from Juneau via Telegraph Creek. It had been chartered by the Department of National Defense to fly the Civil Aviation Branch Western Airways Inspector on an 8,400-mile survey flight to assess potential airports and airways in the Northwest. After assessing Mission Point, the group left for Prince Rupert. Hazelton had been bypassed by progress in transportation. Hazelton had been at the head of navigation for sternwheelers on the Skeena River from Prince Rupert. Then, before the First World War, the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway came west, heading toward the coast and Prince Rupert. Real estate and industrial plans were abandoned. After the First World War, Hazelton was foreseen as the hub of air traffic to Alaska. 20 years later, aircraft no longer needed to stop every few miles. Instead, they flew nonstop to their destinations. Mission Point Airfield reverted to a rough field on a point of land at the junction of the Skeena and Bulkley Rivers, across from Old Hazelton, a delightful community in an alpine setting. The closest major airport to Hazelton is Smithers Regional. But it is not difficult to imagine the activity at Hazelton's long-forgotten airfield that in 1922 was the very first to be licensed in British Columbia.